Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Richard Sachs, Provost and VPAA at University of Rio Grande and Rio Grande Community College, located in Gallia County, Rio Grande, Ohio. This will be the first of a number of monthly television shows that I'll be happy to host. The first week of each month on Wednesday at 3 p.m. will be our president, President Michelle Johnston. I, as Provost, will take the second week. Dr. Tom Worley of the OSU South Centers will take the third Wednesday, and the two deans, David Lawrence and Donna Mitchell, will take the fourth Wednesday. So we're trying to open this up and truly share many of the voices of Rio Grande with the local and even more disparate communities. My show on the second Wednesday of each month will have 4 different sections, and we'll briefly go over that today, and then hopefully next month I'll have some guests on to extrapolate on some of these issues. But the first section each week will be Rio Stories, Real and Surreal. Rio Grande College was founded in 1876, and we have 14 decades of stories. Some of them indeed are real, some are rather surreal, but I hope to bring people onto this show to share those things. The second category will always be Greek life and or student life. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we call Greek life. The first true fraternity in the United States was founded in 1776, the year of our country's founding, at William and Mary College. And believe it or not, it was Phi Beta Kappa. Phi Beta Kappa is no longer a social or residential fraternity. It is now an honor society for high-performing students. And there are Phi Beta Kappa chapters at a limited number of campuses in this country. The first continuing fraternity was founded in 1824 at Princeton University, and it was Chi Phi, that's C-H-I-P-H-I. And Chi Phi was founded as a social and residential fraternity that tried to follow the values of truth, honor, and personal integrity. If you think about those 3 issues, truth, honor, and personal integrity, I think any fraternity or sorority worth its salt tries to fulfill those things. The following year, in 1825, at Union College in Schenectady, New York, Kappa Alpha was founded, the second oldest fraternity in the country. And 2 years later, in 1827, Sigma Phi and Delta Phi were also founded at Union College. In 1831, 4 years later, Sigma Phi, a Sigma Phi chapter was opened at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. So that was the first time that a fraternity founded at an initial college went to another college. And throughout the rest of the 19th century, into the late decades of the 19th century, most of the ancient, what we call ancient, they're not that ancient, but most of the ancient fraternities were founded. The first, initially they were called women's fraternities. The first women's fraternity was founded in 1851 at Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, and that was Alpha Delta Pi. My wife's sorority, Kappa Kappa Gamma, was founded at Monmouth College in the 1860s. Here at Rio, we have a number of social fraternities. There is some talk, and I truly hope that it does occur, that Rio is able to move toward residential fraternities and sororities in the future. And as soon as this fall, that is fall of 2015, we have designated one dorm as a fraternity sorority dorm, and we're hoping, hopefully by as soon as maybe fall of 2016, we can actually have some local fraternity and sorority residential houses. Apropos of that, I spoke to the Rio Grande City Council about a month ago, and there are now no longer any limitations on badging of Greek letters in the area. So I think we've got some positive momentum there. Again, ideally this second section of Greek life or student life will involve me interviewing somebody, and as soon as next month we'll go ahead and do that, either with one of the student leaders from All Greek Council or a member of student government as well. The third section of each show I'm going to call Ohio Valley History and Folklore. The Ohio Valley, of course, the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet in Pittsburgh, and they form the Ohio River. And then the Ohio River goes all the way down to Cairo, Illinois, where it meets the Missouri River and creates the Mississippi River, and that goes down to the Gulf of Mexico then. So again, the Ohio Valley is an area rich in history. Many of you probably know that Marietta, just upriver from us about 50 miles, in 1788 was the original English settlement in the Ohio Valley. My adopted hometown now of Gallipolis, Ohio, the largest city in Gallia County, was the original French settlement in 1790. And Gaul means French and Polis means city. So Gallipolis is literally the city of the Gauls, the city of the French. There's so many stories and things that occur in the Ohio Valley. Again, many of the cities along the Ohio Valley are some of the oldest cities in the old Northwest Territory. Marietta and Gallipolis, and then Cincinnati, a much older city than either Columbus or Cleveland, both of which are much larger than Cincinnati now. And then you keep going, you know, there's Louisville going on to St. Louis. Those are all river cities that developed because of the river commerce in the area. I think those of us who live in the Ohio Valley realize that on both sides of the Ohio Valley, it's kind of like a single common culture. If you're familiar with the Mohawk Indians in upstate New York, they have been given the right to go from First Nations people in Ontario to American Indians in New York State and back. That is, there's a Mohawk reservation that crosses an international border. And it took literally more than a century for that to happen. But the geopolitical boundaries of the state line between Ontario and New York is kind of artificial. And if there weren't a state line there, you wouldn't recognize it. The Ohio Valley, the Ohio River, is a very distinct geographic point on the map. But having said that, when I'm eating lunch in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the people sound the same as they do when I'm eating dinner in Gallipolis, Ohio. So the point that I would say is, yeah, we can be proud of being Ohioans. We can make fun of the Kentuckians. We can make fun of the West Virginians. But guess what? It's all really one culture. It's just different subsets of the same culture. And so much of the history is fascinating. We will try to provide more historical data and pictures and things like that in future months. But if I would just have you reflect for a minute on Blennerhassett Island, about 40 miles upriver near what's now Parkersburg, West Virginia. In the first decade of the 19th century, Herman Blennerhassett, who was a wealthy Englishman of German ancestry, came over and built a huge mansion on Blennerhassett Island. At the same time, this was right after Aaron Burr, who was initially Thomas Jefferson's vice president, 1800 to 1804, and then many people are aware of the Hamilton-Burr duel in which Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a pistol duel, and then ran off to the Northwest Territory, ended up with Blennerhassett on Blennerhassett Island. And from the studies I've done, I think what they were trying to do is go down and take over Texas. Remember, Texas was part of Mexico at the time. However, Thomas Jefferson, who disliked Aaron Burr quite a bit, had him arrested and drawn up on sedition charges and treason charges, arguing that the army that he and Blennerhassett were collecting there on the Ohio River in Blennerhassett Island was actually an army that was going to attack Washington, D.C. and try to take over the United States. I don't think that was the case. I don't know whether Jefferson realized that or not. But all that history is right here on Blennerhassett Island. Unfortunately, the original Blennerhassett mansion was destroyed by fire in the 19th century, but the state of West Virginia, from like 1985 to 1992, rebuilt the mansion. And you can actually go to Blennerhassett Island and see that. Ideally, what I would like to do is bring in musicians, bring in historians, other people who can speak to the very rich culture of this area. And then finally, the fourth and final segment each week will be what I call prevarications of the provost. That is commentary from a chief academic officer dealing with issues of import in terms of higher education. So today I would like to conclude the show with my first prevarications of the provost. More than 2 millennia ago, Greek philosopher Plato wrote during Socrates' trial for heresy, in which he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Think about that point. The unexamined life is not worth living. As college professors, administrators, and students, one of the questions which predicates the higher education curriculum is, what does it mean to be an educated person? Contemporary responses to that important question generally focus on critical thinking skills, critical writing skills, the ability to identify and critique logical fallacies, the ability to do research and to use it appropriately and with documentation to develop cogent arguments and essays. What we now commonly call general education in higher education refers to those courses which are believed to fulfill expectations for student learning that should be pursued by all of our students, regardless of their intended undergraduate major. In order to understand what we study today, and especially why we study what we do, I'd like to review briefly how the concept of what it means to be educated has changed over the last 1,000 years, since the founding of the first modern universities in the English-speaking world at the universities of Oxford, founded in 1167, and the University of Cambridge, founded in 1209, both in England. Medieval university studies focused first on the trivium. Trivium is a Latin word which means 3 ways. And again, we have the word trivia coming from that, which generally just means individual facts that aren't all that important. And that's too bad. But think about tri meaning 3, like tripartite or triad. So the trivium was the 3 ways. Those were considered to be the first 3 ways you need to learn. That is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And those are the oldest subjects that we've taught in higher education. Once competency was achieved, if not mastery was achieved in those 3 areas, the students would then proceed to the quadrivium. And most of you know quad means 4. So you have those 3 initial subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then the quadrivium, which was arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Medieval scholars and teachers were often not geographically static as we generally are now, teaching at only one institution. But they commonly were what we called peripatetic scholars. They wandered around and went from town to town, traveling from one town and region to another. Desiderius Erasmus, born 1466, died in 1536, is one of the better known late medieval wandering scholars, traveling from Turin in what's now Italy to Venice, to Leuven in the Netherlands, and elsewhere, sharing his own knowledge and learning along the way, rather than accepting any number of offers that he received in the early 16th century to commit for any considerable length of time to a single institution and geographic location. Throughout the Middle Ages, and indeed well into the early modern period, university studies were usually limited to young men from the upper classes and also to clerics who were pursuing religious studies. The Renaissance and neoclassical revival only intensified the importance of classical Latin as the preferred language for both study and communication in the academy. Most historians concur that after the Norman conquest of England, that is 1066, that's when the French Normans overtook the Anglo-Saxons in southern England. Even as Anglo-Saxon as a language, which we also call Old English, kind of morphed into Middle English with that influence of the French. Middle English, of course, is the language of Geoffrey Chaucer. But Latin still remained the preferred language of the monastery and of the academy, even as medieval French became the preferred language for the ruling elite in southern England and northern France. So knowing Latin was considered necessary in order to study at universities, and that was still the case for at least the first 150 years in the United States, with the founding of Harvard in 1636, William and Mary 1692, Yale in 1701, and continuing. The association of French with high social class learning and liberal thought continued for centuries as well into the middle and latter decades of the 20th century. I'd like to provide a family anecdote here to help illustrate the primacy of French as the language of the elite on both sides of the Atlantic. When my mother was a senior at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the spring of 1948, she was in a fourth-year German class, and that class was conducted entirely in German. Her professor asked her a question in a language that she thought she recognized as being French. Following classroom protocol, she responded in German to her professor that she did not understand the French language. The professor then violated his own classroom protocol in articulating a zinger in English that is still told in our family more than 6 decades later. He told my mother, "Miss Berman, consider yourself uneducated until you are fluent in the French language." This is a German professor saying that in 1948. In 1948, among people in the Anglophone world, such a statement was tenable. Not so anymore, right? Perhaps we could say one should know Spanish, a growth language in the United States, and still the foreign language of choice for fully 1/2 of all higher education second language acquisition student registrations in the United States. If I use too much Provost speak there, half of all the foreign language courses at American colleges today are Spanish. So would you say now you need to know Spanish to be educated? Perhaps we could suggest instead computer literacy as a basis for being truly educated in the contemporary world. Or perhaps we could suggest one or all of the 3 major growth languages, as documented by periodic studies done by the Modern Language Association of America in the past decade. The 3 major growth languages in American universities are Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, and American Sign Language. And that's in terms of percentage of growth. The salient point here, which you've likely inferred already, is that the knowledge base of what constitutes an educated person has changed over time and will continue to change. I saw the rise of Japanese as a second language for American in the 1980s when I was a young professor and department chair, as well as its decline in popularity in the 1990s and thereafter. I saw the rise of Russian in the 1970s when I was an undergraduate college student, and then its decline in the next several decades, and then its rise again in the last 2 decades as the strategic importance of those native countries shifted, at least from the American perspective. There may be no clear approximate conclusion to these musings except for the takeaway point that each of us must pursue an education, not merely receive an education, that we need to know what we are learning and why we are learning it. Oh, and just to complete the family anecdote, my mother lived another 60 years after her German profs put down, and though she was taking piano lessons again at the end of her life, she never ever learned French. But she made certain that all 3 of her sons were fluent in it. In 1983, when I was a graduate student in Ann Arbor, I took an exam that apparently qualified me as having mastery in French, which became the first of 2 foreign languages that I needed to fulfill a series of requirements for an eventual doctoral degree in English language and literature. And that's something my students always find very interesting. I needed to show knowledge of 2 foreign languages to get a PhD in English. But as somebody who's taught English for over 30 years, it has helped me so much having knowledge of those languages, not just for when I teach an ancient Roman, that is Latin, writer or a French writer, but even for the word roots and the appreciation that it gives me of the English language as well. As I continue to unpack and organize my books in Ohio, and it'll open up things like André Gide's La Porte Étroite or Jean-Paul Sartre's Huis Clos, I realize how much French mastery I have lost in the past 3 decades. I reflect on possibly working to recover that lost mastery. Then I close the book, and instead I take out my acoustic guitar. With very tentative fingers, I wonder whether I'll ever be able, with comfort and aplomb, to do the G minor, to C7, to A major, to D minor chord changes in so many roads without looking tentatively at the neck of my guitar. And that's the end of my first prevarication of the Provost. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you respond to the show. I hope you send me an email at rsax@rio.edu. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this and realize I am only one of the voices of Rio Grande, and I hope in future months to share many of the other voices with you as well. Thank you very much. Take care.